The story begins not on the battlefields of Europe, but behind the barbed wire fences of a dusty Texas camp in 1945. At dawn, a guard on patrol stopped in his tracks, stunned by a scent he hadn't expected, the warm, sweet aroma of fresh bread drifting through the morning air. Inside the camp kitchen, German prisoners of war men who had once fought fiercely for Hitler's Reich were kneading dough, pulling golden loaves from industrial ovens, and even experimenting with American recipes like apple pie and cinnamon rolls. For these men, the contrast was staggering. In Germany, their families stood in bread lines, ration cards barely covering the essentials. Here, even as prisoners, they were surrounded by an abundance of flour, sugar, butter, and coffee. They couldn't believe the sheer scale of it. America was so wealthy, so overflowing with food, that it could afford to feed its enemies better than the Wehrmacht had fed its own soldiers. At first, many of them scoffed at the soft white bread and sugary pies, dismissing them as childish compared to dense rye loaves of home. But curiosity crept in. Soon they were learning techniques from American cooks, adapting family recipes with local ingredients, and discovering that food could be more than survival. It could be a bridge. And so an unlikely dream began to take root. Some of these men would one day return not to their broken hometowns in Bavaria or Saxony, but back to the very country that once imprisoned them. They would open bakeries and restaurants in small-town America, places where the scent of German rye mingled with American apple pie, and where former enemies became neighbors, bound not by ideology, but by the simple, irresistible power of bread. When the United States entered World War II, few Americans imagined their small towns would soon host thousands of enemy soldiers. Yet by 1942, as the Allies captured Axis troops in North Africa and Europe, the question arose where to house them all. Britain was overwhelmed, and shipping them back to devastated Europe was impossible. The answer was simple but surprising: send them to America. Between 1942 and 1946, nearly 372,000 German prisoners of war were transported to the United States. Scattered across more than 150 base camps and 500 branch camps, they became an invisible population tucked away in the heartland. Texas, Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska, Arizona, and dozens of other states suddenly found themselves home to guarded compounds filled with men who just months earlier had been firing on American soldiers. Life inside these camps followed strict military rules, but conditions shocked the Germans. According to the Geneva Convention, POWs had to be fed the same rations as American soldiers. That meant over 3,000 calories a day: fresh bread, butter, milk, meat, fruit, and coffee. For men who had grown used to watery cabbage soup and coarse black bread back home, the abundance was almost unbelievable. Some letters smuggled back to Germany described life in American camps as like paradise compared to the hunger at home. The camps were not simply holding pens. They became makeshift towns with libraries, chapels, theatres, and even classrooms. Many Germans studied English learning phrases that would serve them well after the war. Others took vocational classes, carpentry mechanics, and most notably cooking. In the kitchens, German hands stirred giant vats of soup, baked hundreds of loaves of bread each day, and prepared meals for thousands of fellow prisoners. Here lay the first seeds of a transformation. German soldiers accustomed to scarcity were suddenly immersed in a culture of efficiency, abundance, and flavor. American baking shocked them with its softness, its sweetness, its variety. Donuts, pancakes, and pies rolled out of camp kitchens alongside rye loaves and pretzels. To some, it was childish indulgence. To others, it was a revelation. They learned how to make crusts flaky with shortening, how to prepare cakes with precise measurements, how to organize kitchens that fed thousands with clockwork regularity. Outside the wire, another change was unfolding. America faced severe labor shortages during the war, especially in agriculture. With millions of men, overseas farms struggled to harvest crops. The solution: put the POWs to work. Under guard, Germans picked cotton in Texas, harvested sugar beets in the Midwest, and cut timber in the South. Though paid only in small canteen credits, about 80 cents a day, they were often treated fairly by American farmers. Some were even offered sandwiches, pies, or coffee during breaks, gestures that shocked men who had expected hatred. Imagine the scene: a sunburned German prisoner in overalls seated under a tree, sipping Coca-Cola for the first time in his life, handed to him by the very people his army had once sworn to conquer. Many described these moments as the first cracks in Nazi propaganda. If America treated its enemies this well, what else had they been lied to about? By 1945, as Germany lay in ruins, POWs in America were thriving in an odd way. Some had gained weight for the first time in years. Others had notebooks full of English phrases and recipe cards. Still, others had vivid memories of working alongside American families, memories that would linger long after the camps were dismantled. When the war ended, the prisoners were shipped back to Europe. But what awaited them was devastation. German cities were rubble industries, shattered, and food desperately scarce. The hunger winter of 1946-47 left millions starving. Former POWs who had tasted American abundance now stood in endless bread lines, their stomachs gnawing with hunger. They couldn't help but remember the steaming kitchens of Texas, the fragrant pies of Iowa, the hearty meals that had filled them when America itself was at war. And yet, amid despair, opportunity appeared. In the late 1942 and 1952, as the Marshall Plan poured billions into rebuilding Europe, migration routes reopened. America, with its booming economy and need for skilled labor, welcomed hundreds of thousands of Germans. Among them were men who had once been prisoners on American soil. They carried with them English skills, work habits, and most surprisingly, recipes. For many, the idea of returning to the land of their captivity seemed unthinkable. But the United States offered what Germany could not: stability, prosperity, and a chance to build a future. By the early 1952, some former POWs applied for visas, sponsored by farmers who remembered their work ethic or relatives already in America. They arrived not as enemies but as immigrants eager to contribute. And what could they offer? Their hands knew the rhythm of kneading dough, the careful patience of proofing bread, the comforting artistry of cakes and pastries. They remembered American tastes: apple pie, glazed donuts, soft sandwich loaves, but also cherished their own traditions: dense rye, bread pretzels, Black Forest cake. The idea was irresistible: combine the two and open bakeries and restaurants that offered something new. In towns across Texas, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, German names began appearing above bakery windows. Inside glass cases displayed both American classics and German specialties. Customers lined up at dawn for fresh bread, unaware that the baker behind the counter had once worn a Wehrmacht uniform. Still, shadows lingered. Many locals whispered about the past. Could they trust a man who had once fought under Hitler? Some veterans bristled at the idea of giving business to a former enemy. But bread has a way of softening hearts. Slowly, pretzels dipped in mustard and strudels dusted with sugar became symbols of reconciliation. What started inside barbed wire kitchens in wartime camps had transformed into a story of survival, reinvention, and unlikely friendship. America's greatest strength was not only its weapons and factories, it was its ability to turn enemies into neighbors and prisoners into bakers. The stage was set. The ovens were warm. And soon the real story of transformation of men who chose flour and yeast over hatred and vengeance was about to begin. The clang of the mess hall bell echoed through the camp, just as dawn painted the sky over Texas with streaks of pink and gold. Inside the wire, the routine of the German POWs was strict and predictable: roll call work, detail rations. Yet for those assigned to the kitchen, life took on a different rhythm, measured not in drills or commands, but in the steady knead of dough and the rising scent of yeast. At first, many prisoners regarded kitchen duty as humiliating. Soldiers who once carried rifles now carried sacks of flour. Men who once loaded artillery shells now cracked eggs by the hundreds. But as the days turned into months, something remarkable happened. The kitchen became a place of discovery. The scale of American kitchens left them stunned. Industrial mixers churned enough dough to feed thousands at once. Ovens big enough to roast dozens of turkeys filled the air with warmth and aroma. POWs from rural Germany, accustomed to tiny village bakeries, could hardly believe the efficiency. Everything was measured, standardized, organized with military precision. But it was abundance, not scarcity, that shocked them most. One prisoner from Bavaria, who had apprenticed briefly with a village baker before being drafted, found himself drawn to the ovens. At first he mocked the soft white bread the Americans favored, calling it tasteless compared to dense German rye. But when he was shown how to use refined flour, baking powder, and shortening to create fluffy rolls and golden crusts, his skepticism turned to awe. "This is not bread," he muttered one day, "this is air you can eat." Yet he couldn't deny its popularity. Soon he and his fellow POWs were introduced to American staples: donuts fried in bubbling oil, cinnamon rolls glazed with sugar syrup, and apple pies with crusts so flaky they melted on the tongue. For men whose families back home stretched rations to the breaking point, these desserts seemed like luxuries fit for kings. Letters smuggled through Red Cross channels carried descriptions that left relatives in disbelief. One prisoner wrote, "We are prisoners, yet we eat cakes and white bread our people cannot even dream of." The learning went both ways. German POWs brought their own traditions into the camp kitchens. Pretzels twisted by practiced hands emerged from ovens alongside trays of cookies. Around Christmas, some convinced guards to allow them flour and dried fruit to bake stolen sharing slices dusted with powdered sugar. For American staff, it was their first taste of these European specialties. For the Germans, it was a reminder of home, bittersweet, but also hopeful. Camp records tell of entire kitchens run almost entirely by German labor, supervised lightly by US personnel. The prisoners measured, mixed, baked, and served under strict guidelines. Each day they prepared thousands of meals, stew ladled into tin trays, bread distributed by the loaf, coffee poured by the gallon. In doing so, they learned something essential: how to run a food operation at scale. These skills, drilled into them during captivity, would later prove invaluable in civilian life. Beyond the ovens, interactions with Americans deepened the impression. Some farmers who received POW labor invited them to share simple meals. A slice of pie, a cup of coffee, or a sandwich eaten at a wooden table could leave a lasting mark. One POW recalled years later how he first tasted peanut butter on bread during such a lunch and couldn't believe Americans ate something so rich daily. It was moments like these, mundane to Americans, extraordinary to the prisoners, that began to erode old hatreds. Inside the kitchen, an informal education blossomed. English vocabulary expanded: sugar, flour, oven slice. Recipe cards were copied into battered notebooks. Prisoners practiced pronunciation by reading cookbooks from the camp library. Over time, some began imagining futures not as soldiers but as bakers or cooks. Yet this transformation did not come without tension. Hardline Nazis within the camps often mocked or threatened those who embraced American ways. To them, learning to bake apple pie was betrayal. But hunger and curiosity were stronger than ideology. The smell of cinnamon rolls at dawn had more power than a fading salute to the Reich. There were moments of human connection that no propaganda could erase. In one camp, an American sergeant showed a group of prisoners how his grandmother made pie crust by cutting cold butter into flour with 2 knives, explaining, "The secret is in the flakes." The Germans watched closely, then tried it themselves, producing a crust so light it shocked them. They laughed, not the laughter of enemies but of men, discovering something delightful together. Over time, baking became more than sustenance. It was therapy, a creative outlet, and a bridge. Prisoners found pride in producing food others enjoyed. Guards, though wary, admitted the Germans baked bread better than anyone else in camp. Food softened the sharp edges of captivity. By the time the war ended, countless POWs had touched the ovens, stirred the dough, and served the meals. What began as forced labor had turned into skill, and what began as resentment had turned into admiration. They had discovered not only recipes, but also a system efficiency, abundance, and the idea that food could be both business and community. As they prepared to leave, many clutched notebooks filled with recipes in careful handwriting: pretzels beside donuts, rye beside apple pie. These were not just recipes. They were passports to a new identity, proof that even behind barbed wire they had gained something unexpected: the ability to create, to nourish, to belong. The war had taken their weapons, their freedom, and in many cases their homes. But in return, it had given them a chance encounter with a different kind of power. The soft power of flour, sugar, and yeast. Inside the wire, they had learned that bread could change a man's future. And for some it would. When the war finally ended, the barbed wire gates swung open. The same men who had spent years surrounded by abundance were suddenly shipped back to a homeland where starvation was the rule, not the exception. Germany in 1946 was a scarred wasteland. Cities like Dresden and Cologne lay in ruins, their bakeries reduced to rubble, their ovens cold and lifeless. Families survived on meagre rations, thin slices of black bread potatoes, if they were lucky, and watery soup. For the former POWs, the contrast was agonizing. In America, even as captives, they had eaten better than they had ever eaten at home. They had gained weight, learned skills, and glimpsed a society of plenty. Back in Germany, they were immediately thrown into queues for ration cards, standing in the bitter cold for hours to receive barely enough flour to bake a single loaf. Some described the feeling as whiplash, one day serving steaming apple pie in Texas, the next day staring at bombed-out storefronts and empty shelves. But amid rubble and hunger, the memories of America lingered. The notebooks filled with recipes became symbols of hope. A man who had once stirred giant vats of dough in a Texas camp now stared at broken ovens in Frankfurt and whispered to himself, "One day, I will bake again." The late 1940 seconds brought both suffering and opportunity. With the Marshall Plan in 1948, American aid began to pour into Western Europe. Bags of flour stamped "Gift of the United States" became lifelines. For many former POWs, this deepened their sense of irony. The very nation they had once fought against was now feeding their children. Some began to think the unthinkable. What if their future was not in Germany at all, but back in America? The path was not easy. Immigration laws were strict, paperwork overwhelming. But many had advantages. They spoke English learned in the camps. Some had letters of recommendation from American farmers who remembered their work ethic. A few even had sponsors willing to guarantee them jobs. Slowly applications trickled in, and by the early 1950 seconds, a steady stream of former POWs crossed the Atlantic, not as prisoners this time, but as immigrants chasing opportunity. When they arrived, they stepped into a nation transformed by victory. Suburbs spread outward, highways linked towns and diners, gas stations and supermarkets exploded across the landscape. America was eating more than ever before, and it craved variety. Bakeries flourished, supplying everything from glazed donuts for office workers to birthday cakes for suburban families. Into this booming market walked the Germans with their notebooks, their skills, and their ambition. They started small: a rented storefront, a second-hand oven, a few bags of flour bought on credit. Some used small loans from local banks. Others relied on the Small Business Administration created in 1953, which offered loans to immigrant entrepreneurs. They opened their doors at dawn, selling coffee and bread to factory workers and truck drivers. Pretzels, strudels, and rye loaves lined up next to glazed donuts and apple pie. It was a hybrid menu, and to customers it felt both exotic and familiar. At first, locals were cautious. Word sometimes spread that the new bakery in town was run by a former German POW. Veterans whispered, widows frowned, and some customers stayed away. But others were curious. They wanted to taste the pastries they had seen in Europe during the occupation. They wanted something different from Wonder Bread. Slowly, the smell of fresh pretzels in the morning overcame suspicion. The turning point often came in simple human encounters. A veteran would walk in arms crossed, determined not to trust the man behind the counter. He would buy a loaf grudgingly, take it home, slice into it, and be shocked by its richness, its authenticity. The next week he returned, this time ordering 2 loaves. Soon his wife requested a Black Forest cake for their anniversary. Trust, once unimaginable, was built bite by bite. German bakers leaned into this dynamic blending old-world craft with American tastes. They introduced lighter versions of rye bread sweetened strudels, stuffed with apples, and cakes layered with whipped cream. They embraced American coffee culture, ensuring that no customer left without a steaming cup. Some even added hot dogs and sausages, turning their bakeries into full-fledged restaurants. The hours were brutal. Bakers rose at 3:00 a.m. to start mixing dough, but the reward was independence. These men, once caged behind wire, now stood proudly in shops they owned, serving neighbors who depended on them. They became part of the community, donating bread to church picnics, supplying cookies for school fundraisers, and hiring local teenagers as assistants. Not every story was smooth. Some faced hostility that never fully faded. For certain veterans, the past was too raw, the losses too deep. A few bakeries closed under pressure, but many survived and some thrived, turning into institutions that lasted decades. In towns across Texas, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, German surnames became synonymous not with the enemy, but with warm bread and hospitality. What made their success possible was more than flour and yeast. It was America itself. No other nation offered such opportunity for reinvention. In Germany, they would have remained ex-soldiers marked by defeat. In America, they could be entrepreneurs, neighbors, and contributors to the boom of the 1950 seconds. Their transformation testified to a deeper truth. America's power was not only in tanks and aircraft, but in its ability to absorb former enemies and turn them into builders of prosperity. By the mid-1950 seconds, a curious paradox had taken shape. Some of the men who had once been locked in camps surrounded by barbed wire now ran bakeries just blocks from American Legion halls. Children who had lost fathers in the war now begged their mothers for one more slice of German chocolate cake. The tension never fully disappeared, but it was softened by sugar and bread. It was a quiet kind of victory. No parades, no medals. Just storefronts glowing in the morning light, the scent of warm loaves drifting down Main Street, and the hum of cash registers as communities embraced men who not long before had been enemies. The story of these bakeries is not just about food. It is about redemption, resilience, and the strange alchemy by which flour and yeast can turn barbed wire memories into neighborhood trust. From the ashes of war and the bitterness of defeat rose ovens that baked not only bread but also reconciliation. The morning of the grand opening was cold, the kind of brisk air that made the smell of baking bread all the more irresistible. In a small Texas town, a storefront that once sat empty now glowed with warm light. A hand-painted sign above the door read simply Bavarian Bakery. Inside the glass display case was already lined with pretzels, dusted with coarse salt, glossy loaves of rye, and standing proudly beside them apple pies and glazed donuts. For the man behind the counter, a former German POW, the moment was nothing short of terrifying. He had fought under Hitler's flag. He had marched in uniform, believed in slogans, endured capture. Now, years later, he wore a white apron, his hands coated with flour, facing an American community that remembered the war all too well. Would they come? Would they trust him? Would they forgive? The first customers trickled in, curious neighbors, mothers, tugging children by the hand factory workers on their way to early shifts. They sniffed the air, studied the prices, and ordered cautiously. A donut here, a loaf there. Their politeness was stiff, their smiles tentative. The baker's heart pounded with every sale. Each transaction felt like a silent trial. Then the moment of truth arrived. The door creaked open, and in walked a man with a limp, his coat buttoned tight against the chill. The room fell silent. Everyone knew him. He was a veteran, a man who had fought in the Ardennes, who had lost comrades in the snow of Belgium. His eyes scanned the shelves, then fixed on the baker. The baker froze. Here was the test he feared most. Not the scrutiny of strangers, but the judgment of a soldier who had once seen him as the enemy. For a moment, no one moved. The veteran stepped forward, picked up a pretzel, and held it in his hands as though weighing more than just dough. He broke off a piece, chewed slowly, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, astonishingly, he smiled. "Tastes just like the ones I had in Europe," he said. His voice carried through the shop. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few bills, and added, "I'll take a dozen." The tension shattered. Conversations resumed, laughter filled the air, and suddenly the bakery was alive with customers. The veteran's approval had broken the ice. If he could accept bread from the hands of a former enemy, so could everyone else. Word spread quickly. By the following week, lines stretched out the door in the mornings. Truck drivers stopped for coffee and strudel before long hauls. School children pressed their noses against the glass, begging their parents for cookies. Housewives placed special orders for birthdays and church socials. The bakery, once a gamble, had become a sensation, but not everyone was ready to forgive. One afternoon, a man stormed in his face, red with anger. "How can you people buy from him?" he shouted. He wore the uniform of our enemy. He fought against us. The room fell silent again. All eyes turned to the baker, who stood behind the counter, pale but steady. Slowly he removed his apron and placed it on the counter. His voice shook, but his words were firm. "Yes, I was a soldier," he admitted. "I fought in a war I did not choose. I was captured. And in your camps I was treated with fairness I had never expected. I learned not just how to bake, but how America feeds even its enemies. That changed me. Today I am not your enemy. I am your neighbor. And this bakery is my way of giving back to the country that showed me mercy." There was silence. Then from the corner, the veteran who had first broken bread in the shop spoke again. "If a man can turn guns into bread, maybe that's worth supporting." His words carried weight. The angry customer left without another word. The rest stayed and ordered more pastries. It was in that moment the bakery's true identity crystallized. It wasn't just a shop. It was a stage where reconciliation played out daily, slice by slice, loaf by loaf. Each pretzel sold was a small act of trust. Each apple pie was proof that yesterday's enemies could share tomorrow's table. Over time, the bakery became woven into the fabric of the community. Its window displays at Christmas sparkled with stolen, dusted in powdered sugar. On the 4th of July, the baker proudly placed miniature American flags on cakes. Children who once asked Mommy, wasn't he a German, grew up remembering only the kindness of a man who gave them cookies. The climax of this story was not a battle of tanks and bombs, but a battle of perception, a test of whether wounds could heal through something as simple as food. In a way, it was just as decisive as any military victory. Because when that veteran smiled with a pretzel in his hand, and when townspeople lined up each morning for bread, it marked the triumph of America's greatest strength, not only its might in war, but its capacity for forgiveness, abundance, and second chances. The baker, once defined by barbed wire and uniforms, was now defined by ovens and flour. His weapon was not a rifle, but a rolling pin. His victory was not conquest, but belonging. And his legacy was not destruction, but the sweet smell of bread drifting down Main Street at dawn. By the mid-1950 seconds, what had begun as a risky gamble, former German prisoners of war opening bakeries and restaurants in America, was no longer just a curiosity. It had grown into a quiet movement, one that reshaped small-town main streets and softened the memory of a brutal conflict. The story did not end with that first pretzel sold or that first smile from a skeptical veteran. It continued in the everyday rhythm of loaves, rising ovens, humming, and customers returning again and again. The immediate aftermath was economic. These bakeries created jobs not only for the former POWs, but for local teenagers who needed part-time work and women seeking to supplement household incomes. Delivery trucks rumbled through neighborhoods, dropping off bread to schools, churches, and grocery stores. A bakery once run out of a rented storefront might expand into a larger building with a sit-down cafe attached. The dollars flowing through the cash register were modest, but they rippled outward into suppliers, landlords, and local tax coffers. In communities that had lost men in war and struggled to recover afterward, the presence of a thriving business, even one run by a one-time enemy, was a welcome boost. The cultural impact was equally striking. Many Americans had little exposure to European baking traditions outside of major cities. In towns across Texas, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, people tasted their first authentic strudel, their first rye bread with a dense crumb, their first slice of Black Forest cake layered with cream and cherries. Children who had grown up on Wonder Bread now begged for pretzels hot from the oven. Soon these foods were no longer foreign. They were part of the community's daily life. It was in a sense a culinary diplomacy. What generals and treaties could not always achieve, food did with ease. The Germans brought their old world skills, but they adapted them to American tastes, creating hybrids that symbolized reconciliation. A loaf of rye baked lighter to appeal to suburban families, a donut with a hint of spice from a European recipe, a cake topped with both German cherries and American whipped cream, each was a symbol of cultures merging. On a deeper level, these businesses became living monuments to forgiveness. For veterans who had lost comrades, the idea of buying bread from a former POW had once seemed impossible. But time and familiarity eroded bitterness. Many realized that the man behind the counter was not the Nazi enemy they had fought, but a neighbor, raising children, paying taxes and working hard. In this way, the bakery became more than a shop. It became a classroom where the lesson was simple but profound: enemies could become friends. This transformation held symbolic weight for America as a whole. The nation had demonstrated overwhelming power in war. Its factories produced planes, tanks, and ships faster than the Axis could destroy them. But the real genius of the United States lay in what came after. Instead of clinging to vengeance, America opened doors. It offered small business loans through the Small Business Administration (SBA), welcomed immigrants through revised quotas, and created a climate where even a one-time adversary could succeed if he worked hard. This generosity shocked many former POWs who had expected to be shunned forever. Instead, they discovered that America's strength was not just steel and firepower, it was opportunity. In the long run, the impact was personal as well. Families of these bakers grew up American. Children born in the 1950 seconds and 1960 seconds spoke English without a trace of their father's accent. They joined Little League, went to school, dances, pledged allegiance each morning, and some even enlisted in the U.S. military during the Cold War. For them, the bakery was not a reminder of captivity, but a foundation for belonging. A father who once wore a German uniform now wore flour-stained whites, and his legacy was not war but prosperity. Communities, too, embraced the change. Local newspapers eventually stopped mentioning the word POW in connection with the bakeries. Instead, they printed recipes, featured photographs of smiling families at grand openings, and highlighted donations to civic causes. By the 1960 seconds, many towns had forgotten or chosen to forget that these businesses had their origins in barbed wire kitchens. What mattered was the taste of the bread and the trust that had been built. Of course, not all stories ended in success. Some bakeries closed under financial strain. Others faded when the founder retired. But even those left a mark remembered by generations who associated certain tastes with childhood. That's just like the strudel old Mr. Bauer used to make, someone might say decades later, long after the bakery itself was gone. Memory lingered even when storefronts changed hands. The broader significance reached beyond food. It showed that America's true victory in World War II was not just defeating the Axis but transforming the peace. By giving former enemies the tools to thrive, the US turned potential adversaries into allies. This was the same logic behind the Marshall Plan and NATO, but on a smaller, more intimate scale. A bakery in a Midwestern town was a microcosm of America's global strategy: win trust, not just wars. It also served as a reminder of how abundance itself was a weapon. The fact that German soldiers raised in a culture of rationing, scarcity, and deprivation were overwhelmed by American plenty left a lasting impression. They were shocked not just by bombs and tanks, but by pies and coffee. When some chose to return, it was not simply for economic reasons, but because they had tasted the everyday wealth of a society where even prisoners could eat like kings. In the end, the legacy of these bakeries is one of reconciliation and reinvention. They proved that war's bitterness could be kneaded into something nourishing. They showed that forgiveness could rise like dough left in the warmth, slow but steady, until it transformed everything. And they left behind a lesson still relevant today. Sometimes the most powerful act of victory is not destruction, but creation. So if you ever wander through a small town in America and catch the scent of fresh bread drifting down Main Street, remember, it might just be the echo of a story that began behind barbed wire. A story of men who exchanged rifles for rolling pins and found in flour and yeast the chance to rebuild their lives, and in doing so helped build America itself.